In this video, we're going to extend our full stack app built with NextJs 13 by adding authentication to it. And in doing so, we're going to have a look at the new data fetching concepts and caching strategies in NextJS and a cool new feature called route groups. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamid. I'm a full stack JavaScript developer, and here on this channel, we talk all about modern web dev concepts like React and NextJS. So let's get into this. Okay, let's get started. There was a lot going on here, so I have pre-built a lot of components here, but I'll try my best to explain what exactly we are doing in each and every step. The way that I have built this is that if you go to sign in over here, you would see a completely different layout from where you were seeing before. The whole concept of having these layouts persist throughout our app, or this site navigation persisting for our users' routes, is changed when we are going to our authentication routes or the sign-in route. And we are doing this by a concept in NextJS 13 called route groups. Let's see what route groups are. If you head out to NextJS 13 documentation, you can find this section that talks about route groups. Now you can use route groups to organize your routes without affecting the URL structure, or you can use them to opt in a specific route segment into a layout or break out of the route layout, or you can create multiple route layouts by splitting in your application into different groups. Now the convention is you would create different groups by wrapping the folder name by parentheses. And this, keep in mind, does not affect the URL structure. What does that mean? So in this first example, as you can see in the app folder, we're having a root layout.js, and then we're having a marketing folder or group and a shop group. And these two folders do not change the URL structure in the sense that still page.js in about is mapping to /about. So this marketing does not appear in your actual URL. So the first use case is this. You just organize different folders and pages into different folders without doing anything else. So you're still using that root layout, but you're just organizing your folders and pages for a better developer experience. The second use case is that now your marketing group can have a different layout and your shop can have a different layout. So you're defining different layouts for your different groups. And as you can see, finally, we are splitting our app by defining multiple root layouts, and we no longer have a layout under the app folder, but for each group, we are now defining two different layouts, one for the shop and the other for marketing. And that's exactly how I have extended our own app. So let's have a look at the code. In the app folder, I've created two folders, auth and site. And in the site, I have just copy and pasted all the components that we have created in the previous video. So if you haven't watched that, you watch that first to see how we got where we are, and then continue from here. So this site is just everything that we had before, containing the layout, the page, the header, the footer, and our users over here. So everything that is shared throughout our site. But the idea was for my authentication pages or sign-in page, sign-out page, I didn't want it to show the header and the footer or be inside of that same layout. So I created a different route group, which allows me to define a different layout that's shared only with within this group. And as you can see here in this auth layout, I am rendering this component and plugging in the children over here, which is going to be different pages, whether it be sign-in page or sign-out page or register page. They will be all plugged in here and will be rendered with this same auth layout. As you can see over here, we don't have that navigation up top or the footer down in the bottom. As soon as we go to the sign-in, it breaks out of that site layout and has its own layout. I think this is a very cool feature that's added to NextJS 13, which allows us to organize our pages into different groups and specify different layouts for those groups, so we can just control how different pages are shown. Now we're going to look at the authentication implementation in a second, but before we get there, let me also mention that beside this auth and site folders, I've also created a components folder. I've been trying to co-locate my components with my routes, as you've seen in previous videos. For example, here I had this footer and header living right beside where my page and layouts are, or in the users, we had these loadings pages, users components, or the tweet component over here. So I was co-locating the components before, but I've also gone ahead to try and see what if we have this separate components folder where we can just organize our components as we're used to, while we're also benefiting from this app folder. And I kind of like this approach better. It's the matter of personal preference. What you need to know is that this component is still inside of the app folder, which means it's still by default server components, unless you specify the use client directive that turns them into a client component where you can use React hooks and add interactivity for client-side components. So let's get into implementing authentication. I'm going to use the NextAuth package for this. The first thing that we want to do is to actually go to adapters and select Prisma as our adapter and see what we need to do here to be able to implement authentication using Prisma as an adapter for our database, which is MongoDB in this case. So there are a couple of packages we need to install: the NextAuth itself, the Prisma client, which we already have, and this adapter. Next, in our Prisma client, this is something we've already created, but the way we created it before is a bit different than how it's explained over here. So as you can see, let me close this off. What it is doing here is that it's trying to preserve this Prisma client from being created again and again by saving it in a global Prisma variable and checking to see if this exists. It's not going to create another Prisma client, and if it doesn't, it's just going to create a new Prisma client. So we are persisting this Prisma client instead of just recreating the client over and over again, which is good. And then the last step for us should be actually defining this catch-all NextAuth route as an API endpoint. So if you go to your application, for API endpoints, we're still using the pages directory, just like how we used it in Next.js 12. So in the pages, in the API, we're going to create a new folder called auth. Inside of it, we're going to put this catch-all route called NextAuth.js. And inside of it, we're going to get the NextAuth, get our Prisma client, the one that I just showed, get the adapter. And for this tutorial, I'm using the Google provider. You might have seen on the page that I also have like continue with email. This is not hooked up, so this part of it doesn't work. It's just the Google continue with Google or Google OAuth would work. But nevertheless, the implementation would be the same. And I actually have a video explicitly about NextAuth and how you can define different providers and how you go about setting up different strategies and different databases. I'll link it in the cart somewhere here, so you can check that out if you need to know. But for this tutorial, we're just going to use the Google OAuth, and that's what I'm doing. So I am specifying my Google provider, which needs the client ID and client secret that you need to create on Google Cloud Console. You can create a project, then you can create some credentials for OAuth logins, and then bring in those information here and save them in your environment variables in .env or .env local, so you can read them here and kind of configure this provider for NextAuth. What I'm doing here is that I've specified for pages that for signing page, I'm using this custom signing page, because if you know, NextAuth comes built in with pages that you can use out of the box. So it has sign in page, sign out page, error pages, verify email pages and stuff. So if you don't define anything, it will use NextAuth's built-in pages. But because I wanted to just show this, route groups and different layouts. So I've specified a custom page that I'm using. For everything else, I'm still defaulting back to the NextAuth built-in pages. I have specified that I'm using an adapter, Prisma adapter in this case, and I'm passing in the Prisma client we have created, and I'm using a jaw token strategy. And the reason for specifying this is, if you're specifying an adapter for NextAuth, it thinks you want to use a database strategy for your authentication, which is not what I want to use. I want to still use JSON Web Tokens or a token-based strategy for my authentication, but I want to save the user information. That's why I'm having this Prisma adapter or a database to begin with. It's that when a user actually clicks in here and registers or signs in with a Google OAuth, I want to save their information and actually show them in my user. So that's the idea. Once you sign in here, I want to be able to add that new user here, and eventually maybe we will create, an ability for the user to create their own tweets, maybe go and like and unlike other people's tweets and stuff. So that's the idea there. So that's why we're using this adapter and a database to save that user information so we can just render them here. So that was the first step for implementing our authentication. Let's see if there's anything else that we need to do. So when we are using Prisma, we have to define our schema. Now there are more models that we need to create for Prisma to be able to work. So the DB is what we already have. The client is what we already have. We need to create a new model called account, a session, so that we are kind of tracking the sessions of logged in users. And the user model is a bit different than the way that we have created it. So there is email verified, an image or accounts and sessions linking to these models over here. And then there is a verification token for email logins, which we're not going to use, but we're going to define it here. So what I have already done is in the schema Prisma, I have defined these models over here. So I have my account, I have the session, the user, and the verification token. I also had the tweet from before. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the first section that you see, this Prisma schema, is not for MongoDB, and you can tell from the regular IDs here. MongoDB IDs need to be mapping to _ID. So if you scroll down, it's actually here. They have a section about MongoDB specifically, where it tells you have to change the IDs to this, and for these refresh tokens, you have to change them instead of the text to DB string, because that's how MongoDB defines strings. So once you do this, you have to then run npx prisma generate. Remember, every time that you change your schema in Prisma, you have to call npx prisma generate to generate the Prisma client based on your schema. You won't need to run migrate for MongoDB, because that's not how MongoDB works. As long as you run the npx prisma generate, you should be good to go. And that's as far as Prisma schema goes. So what I've done, going back to the app, is I have included this sign-in button. I don't know if it existed before or not, and even if it did, it wasn't doing anything. Now in this sign-in button here, which is in my header, let's see what's happening over there. So if I come to site, on the header, that's where I'm showing this navigation. I have added this login button, and that's the one that's showing up there, the sign in. So let's see what this login button is doing. Now this login button is a client component, and the reason why it was a client component is because I'm calling some of the NextAuth functions, such as sign in and use session, to get the current user, or to sign them in if they're not, or send them to the sign in page. So I have marked it as a client component. And what I'm doing here is that I'm calling the use session hook from NextAuth to see if there's a session or not. If there is a session, I want to show the user's image up there like an avatar. If they don't have an image, I'm just going to show this dummy SVG component. And if there is not a session, what I'm going to render is just a button that says sign in on it. And then on click, I'm just going to call this sign in method from NextAuth, for which if you're familiar with NextAuth, it's just going to redirect the user to our sign in page. So in NextAuth, if you're calling sign in without passing any arguments to it, it would just redirect you to the sign in page. And the benefit is that when it redirects you to the sign in page, as you can see here, it also sets this callback URL. This makes sure that once you actually sign in, you're going to be redirected back where you start off. So if you were on the home page and you clicked sign in, once you sign in, you go back to home page. If you were on the user page and you clicked sign in, you'll be redirected back to the user page after you successfully finish this flow. Another way of doing it, instead of a button and calling this function, was just to have a link to go to our own sign-in page, because that's a custom page that we are rendering the sign-in, and that sign-in is coming from here. So in the app, in the auth, I have this sign-in, and remember, these route groups are not affecting the URL, so it's just going to be /sign-in. This is just invisible to the app. It's just for grouping purposes or for defining different layouts. So another way would have been just to go to /sign-in, but we wouldn't have this callback URL set there, and we would have need to do this manually ourselves. But NextAuth gives us this functionality. We can just call in sign-in function without any argument. It would just set that redirect URL or callback URL, which we can use to redirect the user back to where they started from. So that's what this sign in button is doing. Okay. Now for the sign out, I'm not showing anything. I just wanted to show we can have different pages that now share this same layout that is in this group. Now, before we go ahead and continue on the sign in flow and add a new user, let's look at our user component. Now, if we go to the app and the site, which is what we previously had, we have this users folder where we are rendering users component pages and layout, and we have our individuals users under this user ID folder. So let's just start with this users layout page and then the user component. Now, as you might have remembered from the previous video, I was fetching users in the user component. Now, this was a component that I'm rendering in my layout. So ignore this part for a second. I was rendering this layout and this user component. I was not receiving users as a prop. Instead, on the users component, I was going ahead and actually fetching users from this get user function we created in our Prisma kind of library. I moved this data fetching back to the layout for a reason that I'm going to explain shortly. As you can see here, I created this new function. That's the convention of having data fetching functions in NextJs 13, where you can call your database functions, check to see if you have results, throw errors if you don't, and then call that data fetching function inside of your page component. It will be the same result if you were to call your database access objects inside of here, as you seen already done before in the previous video. But let's go to the documentation to talk about data fetching. Now, if you go back to the NextJs documentation, on the upgrade guide, there's a section that talks about migrating data fetching methods. As you know, in NextJs 12 or in the pages directory, we had get server-side props and get static props as methods to fetch data, either at the build time or at request time inside get server-side props. Now, we don't have these functions in NextJs 13. Instead, we are using the fetch API to kind of simulate the same thing these two functions were doing. Now, if you scroll down the page, you would see that inside of our page functions, we can now have this fetch functions with different cache control settings on them, kind of simulating the behavior of get server side props and get static props. For example, so here on the first fetch call function, we have cache control set to force cache. This is similar to get static props because it forces NextJs to cache the response of this fetch and keep it until it's manually invalidated. Similar to get server-side props, if you set cache to no store, so it's not going to store or cache the result of this fetch request, which means that this request or this resource is going to be refetched on every request, which kind of simulates the get server-side props. And then to mimic the get static props, when you have incremental static regeneration, where you would set a revalidate property on get static props, here you can set the next.revalidate option on your fetch request to simulate get server-side props or incremental static regeneration, whereby the response would be cached with a lifetime of 10 seconds in this case, and this number is in seconds. So if you continue on the page, you would see examples of server-side rendering, how you would run this in pages directory inside of a get server-side props to fetch some data, and how you would do the same thing inside of the app directory by having a specific function, in this case get projects, calling fetch, but then setting this cache control to no store. And as you scroll down, you will see examples for static site generation, ISR, and more. But what if we are not using fetch? Just like in our example, if you're using Prisma, which is an ORM, or sometimes you're using your database client, and you don't have direct control over the fetch or the settings you would like to pass to kind of simulate this caching behavior that we had in Next.js 12. What do we do for those? So if you head out to data fetching section, which I recommend you to read because it kind of gives you this new concept of data fetching in Next.js 13 and how it's kind of different mental model from the previous versions. So at the bottom of this, I think on the fetching side, if you scroll down at the bottom, you're going to see a section here talking about static data fetching and dynamic data fetching, which talks about if your page is statically built or it's a dynamic data fetching, meaning that it will be fetching data on every request by setting different, again, cache controls for your fetch function, or a revalidate, something similar to what we have already talked about. But then coming down in this page, you're going to see a section where it talks about data fetching without the fetch function. And as I explained, sometimes you're using third-party libraries, ORMs, and database clients, and you don't have direct control over caching of or revalidating behavior of these functions. In those cases, you have two options. One is to just rely on the default caching behavior of that page, and you can read how that's defined. So if you're using dynamic functions such as cookies or headers, it will be a dynamic route. But if you're not, it will by default be a static page, so it just caches the fetch results, which might be ideal or not ideal for your use case. Or you can specify your own cache configuration for that segment. You can use segment cache configuration to customize the cache behavior of the entire segment, and segment be that specific path or URL or segment of your path. So it basically affects the whole page. Whereas when you are defining cache on the fetch, you are defining settings per request. So you can have two different fetch functions if you're using fetch directly that have different caching kind of strategy or requirement. But when you're setting this segment configs, which we're going to review in a second, it just changes the behavior of the whole page or the whole segment. You can still have a more specific caching strategy per your fetch requests if you're also having a fetch request on that page. But doing this, I'm assuming that we're not using fetch. We are using an ORM or a database client or a third party that doesn't give us access to the fetch directly. Interestingly enough, their example is also using Prisma. And as you can see here, they have this get posts function, the same way that I try to kind of fetch our users over here with a function. And then they have the page component, but you could also see this revalidate config being exported from the page that says, hey, revalidate this page every hour or this data every hour. So this is in seconds. Let's actually look at different segment cache config options you can export from your page. As you can see here, we can export dynamic params, revalidate, fetch cache, runtime, and preferred region from our pages that allows us to configure the behavior of a segment of a page or layout. So let's see what each of these guys are. So the dynamic one changes the dynamic behavior of a layout or page to be fully static or fully dynamic. So you could set it to auto, or it's the default. You could force it to be dynamic or force it to be static. You can read through the docs here, but the default, which is the auto, it caches as much as possible without preventing any component from opting into dynamic behavior. If you want it to be fully dynamic, you can just force dynamic. And if you want it to be static, you could just force static. Now the dynamic params I've already covered in the last video, but this defines what happens when a dynamic segment is visited by the user that was not generated statically with the generate static params. So if you remember on the user ID page, if I go here, on this page, we close this off, where we are rendering dynamic routes, we exported this generate static params from it to instruct NextJs what values for that dynamic segment we want to statically build. And this defaults to true, meaning that if a segment is not included or is not returned from your generate static params function, well, it will go ahead and generate it on demand. So that's the default. And that's why, even though I didn't have this function in the beginning, I was still able to see different users because it just goes ahead and generates those pages on demand. Whereas if you set it to false, it would just 404. This is similar to how we would define a fallback property for get static paths in NextJS 12, whereby we could have been true, where we show a fallback kind of component. It could have been false, so there wouldn't be a fallback. It was just going to 404, and then blocking was to generate that page on demand without showing any fallback state. The other thing that we can export from our page is this revalidate that we've seen together. So the revalidate property has different values. You could set it to false, so it never kind of revalidates that page. It forces cache, and you can also pass in 0 or a number. So going back to our users layout where I'm fetching my users, currently we are not exporting any segment config option, which means this page by default is a static page, and it's not going to refetch my users on every request. Which also means that if on our application a user comes in and signs in, once we have a new user, it's not going to actually refetch that user to show it on this list, because this is a static page. But as I just explained, we can export different segment config options from our page that allows us to control the behavior of our page. And specifically, I want to export this revalidate property. And by setting it to 0, I want to make sure that this page is always rendered dynamically. So therefore, if a new user comes in and registers on our app, we would be able to dynamically fetch that newly created user and show it in this users list. Now, something to note that when exporting revalidate 0 in the development server, it just sometimes throws an error. It works fine in production and when you're using the next start, which runs the production server. But for some reason, it interferes with the way that your dev server is working. I wasn't able to figure out why this is happening, but something to note. Generally speaking, the development server renders every page, so you won't actually see the fetching or this caching strategy if you're on the dev server, because everything is server rendered. If you want to see it in action, you have to build your application and then serve it up using the production server to see these different caching strategies in effect. And overall, you might come across different bugs in the app directory as well, as it's expected because it's in the beta version. I also encountered some different bugs here. The idea here is for us to know where Next.js is kind of headed. The app directory is yet not ready for production, so have that in mind while you're trying out or following along with these tutorials. So what I'm going to do here with this revalidate set over here, I'm going to actually stop the dev server and run npm build. I'm using pnpm, so pnpm run build. It's just going to create a production bundle, which I can then serve up by running pnpm run start, and then actually test out and see if what we've done here works. So that's done. Let's go pnpm run start. I go to the application. Let me just clear any cache that I have over here and cookies. Let me refresh the page. Okay, so now on the users, as you can see, we have our 2 users. Everything is working fine. And I go ahead to sign in. It redirects me to the sign in page. I'm having that callback URL set over there. I hit continue with Google, takes me to the Google sign in page. I select my account. I should be then redirected back to the users page. As you can see here, the newly created user is fetched over here because I have set the revalidate property to 0. So I'm seeing this user here, and up there, because I'm now logged in, as I have shown you in the beginning of the video, if we go to the header where we are actually showing this login button, if there is a user, by checking this use session hook, we are just showing their image as an avatar there. Something to note here is that for us to be able to use this use session hook from the NextAuth package to check to see if the user is logged in, we had to turn this component into a client component by putting this use client directive up top. Now, what if you wanted to check if the user is authenticated or logged in a server component? If you head out to the NextAuth documentation, there's this Next.js section under the configuration where they talk about this newly created function, unstable get server session, that's going to replace the current get session function that you can call to retrieve the session on the server side. Now, currently in NextAuth, you have to call get session from inside your get server side props or in your API routes to get the session. But it's not the ideal way of actually retrieving the session, and that's why they're creating this new get server side session. So you can go ahead and use it. This is going to be your NextAuth. That's the regular setting that you have. And inside of get server side props, instead of calling get session, you're just going to call this unstable get server side session and get the session over here like before. In API routes, again, instead of the get session, you're going to use this one. And in the app directory, which they have kind of included for the Next.js 13, on your page components that are server components, you can still get this unstable get server side sessions from the NextAuth package and check the session on a server component without having to turn it into a client component. But in this case, I did turn it into a client component because on top of use session, I'm also using this sign in function, which is a client side function that will redirect the user to the sign in page by setting the callback URL. But you can go ahead and use this new unstable get server session from the NextAuth package to check the session on your React server components without having to turn them into client components and losing all the functionality and features that comes with React server components. That's a wrap for this video, folks. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments for me. I'm pretty responsive there and I would love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.